So today I want to talk about something that most channels will not tell you directly. And I want to be very precise because what happened in the Negev desert on the night of March 21st changes the entire framework through which you need to understand this war. Not symbolically, not diplomatically, operationally. Iran fired ballistic missiles at Dimona, and Israel could not stop them. Now, before you move past that sentence, I want you to understand what Dimona actually is, not what the Israeli government officially says it is. What it actually is. Dimona is the home of the Shimon Peres Negev Nuclear Research Center. It is the facility where, according to every serious intelligence assessment and every major government that has studied the question, Israel developed its nuclear weapons program. It is the most protected piece of ground in the Middle East. It sits at the center of the most layered air defense architecture that American and Israeli engineers have constructed over half a century of investment. Iron Dome, David's Sling, Arrow 2, Arrow 3. THAAD batteries positioned specifically to guard that zone. Iran fired at that zone, the interceptors launched, and they failed. This is not a story about missiles. This is a story about a system that broke. And once a system like that breaks, it does not simply get repaired. It signals something. And that signal is now traveling through every defense ministry, every intelligence community, every military planning office from Tel Aviv to Washington to Beijing. So let me walk you through exactly what broke, why it broke, what Iran understood when it fired those missiles, and what the structural consequences are for everything that comes next. Because the headline that Iran struck near Dimona is already old. What matters is what it tells you about where this war is going. Let me start with what actually happened because the sequence matters more than the event itself. On March 21, 2026, American and Israeli forces struck Iran's Natanz nuclear enrichment facility using bunker buster bombs. Natanz has been struck before, in the first week of this war and during the 12-day war last June 2025. This was the third time. Iran's Atomic Energy Organization confirmed the strike. The Iranian government characterized it as a direct attack on their sovereign nuclear infrastructure. Hours later, Iran responded with a ballistic missile strike on the southern Israeli city of Dimona, and then, separately, on the nearby town of Arad. The Israeli military acknowledged what happened in the most controlled language military institutions use when they have nothing good to say. They said air defense systems were activated. They said interceptors were launched. They said those interceptors failed to hit the threats. And they said the circumstances in each case were under investigation. Now, here is the first thing you need to understand. This was not a glitch. This was not bad luck. Iran's parliament speaker Mohammad Bagher Ghalibaf said it openly before the dust had even settled. He posted on social media, "If Israel cannot intercept missiles in the most heavily protected zone in the country, it is a sign that the battle has entered a new phase." That is not a politician speaking. That is a military acknowledgement that Iran's targeting and delivery calculus has shifted in a way that changes what is possible. And what did Iran use? The Zolfaghar, a ballistic missile in the Fateh family, short to medium range, 700 to 800 kilometers. Not Iran's most advanced weapon, not a hypersonic system, not a weapon that requires extraordinary technology to intercept. The Zolfaghar is a known system with known flight characteristics. Arrow 3 was designed for exactly this kind of threat, and it missed. Why does that matter? Because it tells you something about the state of Israel's intercept capacity that no official statement will directly confirm, but that the evidence now makes impossible to deny. Let me give you the numbers, and I want you to hold them carefully. Before this war began in February 2026, RUSI, the Royal United Services Institute, which is Britain's most established defense think tank, was already calculating Israel's intercept inventory based on pre-war assessments. Their analysis found that by March 24th, Israel had expended 122 of approximately 150 Arrow 2 and Arrow 3 interceptors. That is more than 80% of its primary anti-ballistic defense stockpile in less than 4 weeks of fighting. The THAAD batteries protecting Gulf allies had also burned through a significant portion of their magazine. Each Arrow interceptor costs between $2 and $4 million and takes months to produce. Each THAAD interceptor costs $12 million. Iran's Zolfaghar costs a fraction of either. And then came the cluster munition problem, which compounds everything. Iran began equipping ballistic missiles with cluster warheads early in the conflict. A cluster warhead releases dozens of smaller submunitions when it approaches the target. To be effective, Israel needs to intercept the missile before it opens. If it opens in the air, you now have 40 or 50 separate projectiles falling across a wide area. By March 10th, Israel's Home Front Command confirmed that 50% of incoming Iranian missiles were carrying cluster warheads. By early April, a J.P. Morgan research paper calculated that the missile impact rate inside Israel had risen from 3% in the first 2 weeks of the war to 27%. That number is not moving in the direction that wins wars. And here's the structural fact that Israel could not say publicly, but that its own emergency budget decisions confirmed. On the same night that Semaphore reported Israel had informed the United States it was critically low on interceptors, the Israeli government voted by emergency phone conference to transfer 2.6 billion shekels, roughly $826 million, in urgent defense procurement funds. You do not hold emergency midnight budget votes because everything is fine. A Trump administration official, speaking to investigative outlet Drop Site News, said that by the eve of the ceasefire announcement on April 7th, Israel's remaining interceptor stock had fallen to double digits. The country that called itself the most sophisticated air defense system in the Middle East was left with fewer ballistic missile interceptors than you need fingers and toes to count. And Israeli commanders had been quietly doing something that no military in a defensive war wants to admit. They had been picking and choosing which Iranian missiles to engage and which ones to let fall in open areas. That is the interceptor story. Now let me connect it to what happened at Dimona, because those two realities are not separate. They are the same story told from different angles. Iran did not fire at Dimona by accident. Iran fired at Dimona because it understood the intercept math, because it understood that Israel was rationing its most capable defensive missiles, because it understood that the most protected zone in the country had become, through weeks of sustained attrition, less protected than it appeared. And when the missiles hit and the interceptors failed, Iran's military planners got the confirmation they needed. The defensive architecture of Israel's most sensitive piece of real estate had been penetrated, not destroyed, not catastrophically damaged. Penetrated, and in military terms, that is often enough. Now, what does this force next? And this is where the analysis gets important, because the events of the last 48 hours tell you exactly where things stand on April 15th, 2026. A 2-week ceasefire was announced on April 7th and April 8th. The United States and Iran reached an agreement mediated by Pakistan, under which Iran committed to reopen the Strait of Hormuz, and both sides would halt hostilities while peace talks proceeded. That announcement was followed within hours by Israel launching what it called Operation Eternal Darkness, its largest coordinated strike on Lebanon since the war began, killing at least 357 people in a single night. Iran responded by closing the Strait of Hormuz again. The ceasefire that was announced lasted approximately 1 day before the architecture of the deal began collapsing under its own contradictions. And then face-to-face talks between the United States and Iran took place in Islamabad, Pakistan. The first direct in-person negotiations between the two governments since the 1979 Islamic Revolution. And those talks, after marathon sessions, failed to produce an agreement. The United States demanded Iran end uranium enrichment, dismantle its major enrichment facilities, allow the retrieval of its highly enriched uranium, and fully open the Strait of Hormuz without charging passage tolls. Iran refused on every major point. Iran's position is that it controls the strait. It intends to keep that control, and any deal must include a permanent end to American and Israeli attacks, not just a temporary pause. As of today, April 15th, 2026, the United States has declared a naval blockade on Iranian port traffic. CENTCOM announced that ships entering or exiting Iranian ports would be intercepted. The IRGC has placed its forces on maximum combat alert. Iran's defense minister has warned that any military vessel approaching the strait will be considered a ceasefire violation. Oil prices are approaching $100 a barrel, up roughly 40% since the war began. Daily shipping traffic through the Strait of Hormuz has fallen by over 90% from pre-war levels, according to the Joint Maritime Information Center in Bahrain. And U.S. Energy Secretary Chris Wright said publicly that prices will likely keep rising until meaningful traffic flows through, which he estimated could take weeks. This is the structure of where we are. And I want to use that structure to show you the three things that the Dimona strike and the interceptor depletion crisis actually tell you about this war that nobody is saying directly. Structural fact number one: Iran's missile strategy was never designed to destroy Israel. It was designed to bankrupt Israel's defense. This is the most important thing to understand about how Iran has been fighting this war from the beginning. Iran is not trying to overwhelm Israel with a single decisive barrage. Iran is firing a calculated number of missiles every single day at a pace that forces Israel to respond with interceptors that cost 100 to 300 times more than the incoming threat. On day one of this war, Iran fired approximately 90 missiles at Israel. By early April, that number had dropped to 10 to 15 per day. Most people looking at that trend said, see, Iran is being degraded. Iran is running out of missiles. But that reading is exactly backwards. Iran reduced the volume of each salvo precisely because it switched to cluster munitions. Fewer missiles, more submunitions, more intercepts required, faster depletion of the aero stockpile. The Dimona strike was fired with Zolfaghar missiles, a system Iran manufactures in dispersed underground factories across its territory. The IDF struck 4,000 Iranian targets by March 31st. The U.S. military struck over 13,000 Iranian targets as of April 6th. And yet on April 7th, Iran still fired the largest salvo in 3 weeks. The missile factories have not stopped, the underground bases have not been silenced, and Israeli interceptors are in double digits. Structural fact number two: the ceasefire is not a ceasefire. It is a constraint lock. What happened between April 7th and today is not a pause in the war. It is the war entering its most structurally dangerous phase. Both sides agreed to a ceasefire. Both sides immediately violated it. Israel attacked Lebanon within hours of the announcement. Iran closed the strait again in response. Peace talks collapsed in Islamabad. The United States responded by declaring a naval blockade. And now both sides are sitting in a position where neither can fully escalate and neither can fully withdraw. Iran cannot allow the strait to be opened on American terms because the Strait of Hormuz is the only leverage Iran has that guarantees a permanent end to future American and Israeli attacks. The United States cannot accept Iranian sovereignty over the strait because 20% of the world's oil supply depends on free navigation, and American financial credibility depends on that oil flowing in dollars. Israel cannot accept a ceasefire that does not include Lebanon because Hezbollah, which has killed over 2,000 Lebanese people and fired 71 attacks on northern Israel in a single day during the war, is still operating under Iranian direction from Lebanese territory. None of these positions are negotiable on the terms currently on the table, which means the ceasefire is not a resolution. It is a pressure cooker with no agreed release valve. Structural fact number three: the interceptor depletion is not just Israel's problem. It is a Western strategic problem with no quick solution. Here is something that the official statements are carefully managing, but that the data makes clear. The United States fired over 150 THAAD interceptors during the 12-day war in June 2025. That was estimated to be roughly 25% of the entire American THAAD inventory at the time. 8 months later, this war began. The Pentagon moved Patriot batteries from South Korea to the Middle East. CENTCOM drew down intercept capacity from other theaters. And by mid-March, Semaphore reported that American officials had privately acknowledged the constraint, noting that Israel's depletion was expected, that solutions were being worked, and carefully adding that the United States was not facing a similar shortage, while in the same breath reporting that $2.4 billion worth of Patriot interceptors had been used in the first 5 days of this war alone. A single THAAD interceptor takes years of production pipeline to replace. Arrow 3 takes months per unit. The Israeli Defense Ministry announced emergency acceleration of aero production, but production acceleration is a matter of industrial capacity, component supply chains, and assembly timelines. It cannot be achieved in weeks. Iran's drone factories, by contrast, are dispersed across basement workshops and warehouses in dozens of cities. They cannot all be struck simultaneously. They rebuild quickly, and each drone they fire costs approximately $50,000 while consuming interceptors that cost millions. This is the exchange ratio that determines the long-term trajectory of every air war, and in this one, it is moving in one direction. Now, I want to address the three questions that are circulating right now because I hear them every time someone watches a video about this war. Question 1. Did Iran actually damage the Dimona Nuclear Facility? The answer is no, based on every verified report. The International Atomic Energy Agency confirmed no damage to the research center and no abnormal radiation levels. The missiles struck residential areas in the city of Dimona and the town of Arad, roughly 9 and 35 kilometers from the nuclear site, respectively. The strategic significance of the strike was never about damaging the reactor. It was about demonstrating that the defensive envelope around that facility had been penetrated. Iran's state media said the strikes targeted the nuclear facility, which is Iranian strategic messaging, not targeting precision. The symbolism is the point. Question 2. Is this ceasefire going to hold? Based on the structural constraints I have just walked you through, no ceasefire holds permanently when neither side's fundamental demands have been addressed. Iran's 10-point framework includes Iranian control of the Strait of Hormuz, an end to attacks on Lebanon, the lifting of all sanctions, and security guarantees against future American or Israeli strikes. The United States framework includes the dismantling of Iranian enrichment capacity, no Iranian nuclear program, zero Iranian control of maritime passages, and an end to Iranian funding for Hezbollah, the Houthis, and Iraqi militias. These two frameworks are not positions that can be split down the middle. They reflect incompatible definitions of what security means in the post-war Middle East. What you are watching in the next 2 weeks is not negotiations toward a deal. It is both sides assessing the costs of resuming full-scale hostilities. Question 3. What happens if the ceasefire fully collapses? If talks fail and the blockade escalates into direct military confrontation in the strait, you get the scenario that the financial markets are already pricing in. The Strait of Hormuz carries 20% of the world's oil. The U.S. Energy Secretary has already said prices will rise until the strait reopens. Brent crude at $100 a barrel is where we are on April 15th. Iran has threatened to push it toward $200. The last time oil stayed above $100 for a sustained period, it created political conditions that ended governments. Trump's stated political identity is the stock market and the economy. The S&P 500 is watching oil prices in real time. Now let me put this all together because the Dimona strike is not the story. It is the indicator of the story. The story is this: a war that was launched with the stated goal of destroying Iran's military and nuclear capabilities and achieving regime change has, after 6 weeks of sustained strikes, produced the following results. Iran has not surrendered. Iran's missile production has not stopped. Iran's underground missile bases have survived 13,000 American strikes and 4,000 Israeli strikes and are still operational, with satellite imagery from April 10th showing Iranian crews actively removing debris from blocked tunnel entrances during the ceasefire window. Iran has demonstrated the ability to penetrate Israeli air defenses over its most sensitive nuclear site. Israel's primary anti-ballistic missile inventory has been driven to double digits. The United States has spent an estimated $2.4 billion in Patriot interceptors alone in the first 5 days. Peace talks in Islamabad have collapsed. The Strait of Hormuz remains under Iranian control. And the ceasefire, announced on April 7th, has already been violated by both sides. This is the operational picture as of today. And here is what this picture tells you about the constraints structure that governs everything that comes next. Iran's conditions for a permanent settlement have not changed since the war began. American bases in the region cannot serve as platforms for future attacks on Iran. The Strait of Hormuz must remain under Iranian authority as a guarantor of Iranian security. The sanctions regime that has strangled the Iranian economy for decades must end, and Iran's allies, Hezbollah in Lebanon, the Houthis in Yemen, the resistance factions in Iraq, must be part of any regional settlement. These are not negotiating positions designed to be traded away for smaller concessions. These are the minimum structural requirements for an Iran that has just survived an existential assault to believe that the next American or Israeli government will not simply try again in 5 years. America's conditions, as stated in the 15-point framework and as made operational by the declared blockade, are incompatible with Iranian sovereignty as Iran defines it. The Trump administration wants Iran's nuclear program dismantled, its enriched uranium removed, its military reach constrained, its straight leverage eliminated. And Trump wants this while simultaneously telling the American public that America has won the war, that the military objectives have been achieved, that oil will flow again, that the economy will recover. These two sets of conditions cannot both be true at the same time in the same world. That is the lock. That is the constraint that explains every statement made in the last 72 hours, every military movement, every diplomatic communication. Both sides are testing whether the other side will blink before the 2-week window expires. Here is what the structure tells me about the path forward. The most powerful actor in this situation right now is not the United States military. It is the global oil price. Trump's political calculus is visible and it is real. He has staked his second term on economic performance. Brent crude at $100 is painful. At 120, it becomes a political crisis. At 150, it becomes the defining issue of his presidency. The moment the American consumer feels this war in their gas bill and their grocery receipt in a way that moves poll numbers, the pressure for an exit intensifies beyond what any single military objective can offset. Iran knows this. Iran has known this since 2020 when it analyzed American behavior in Vietnam, in Iraq, in Afghanistan, and built its entire strategic response around the principle that America's pain threshold is finite and measurable. The Dimona strike was not a military victory for Iran. It was an operational signal. It told the world, and specifically the American government, that the defense of the region's most sensitive nuclear site has been compromised. And it told Israel, more painfully than any diplomatic note could, that the interceptors guarding the Jewish state's most important strategic asset are running out, and the factory that replaces them cannot keep up with the rate at which Iran is depleting them. That is the message inside the missile, and the people who needed to receive it received it. So that is where we are today, April 15th, 2026. The ceasefire is fragile. The talks have failed in their first round. The blockade of Iranian ports began Monday. The Strait of Hormuz remains 90% closed to normal traffic. Israel is in double digits on its strategic interceptors. The world's oil supply is running through a choke point that neither side controls cleanly. And two governments that cannot afford to lose are sitting across a negotiating table that collapsed once already, deciding whether to walk back in or walk away. This is not prophecy. This is structure. This is the logic of a system under pressure. I may be wrong about where individual moves lead, but the direction is what the data shows. And the data shows a war that is not over, a ceasefire that is not stable, and a strategic situation where the cost of continuing rises for everyone, but not at the same rate and not in the same places. The question is not whether a settlement comes. The question is what conditions force the party with less time to accept the party with more patience. History has an answer to that question. It has always had an answer. And right now, history is watching to see whether anyone in Washington is paying attention to it.